This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. This past weekend, flood waters devastated several communities in Connecticut, washing out more than 24 state roads and destroying bridges. Many residents were forced to evacuate, and 2 people died. On top of that, small businesses were damaged, and at least one town will delay the start of its school year. In the aftermath, Governor Ned Lamont declared a state of emergency. And as of yesterday, President Joe Biden approved a federal emergency declaration for Fairfield County, New Haven County, and Litchfield County. That means state agencies can work with FEMA on recovery efforts. Today, we'll talk about the recent flooding, the impact it's had on people, infrastructure, and small businesses, and how we might prepare for future severe storms. Joining us now in studio is our own Connecticut Public team. Abby Brown is our housing reporter, and Michaela Savitt is the state government reporter. Thank you, both of you, for joining us today.
Good morning.
Good morning, Kat.
And listeners, if you have any questions or comments about what you're seeing this week where you live, we want to hear from you. Let us know how has flooding impacted your community. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Abby, I want to start with you this morning. How much rain did the state get over the weekend, and what areas were hit the hardest?
Yeah, the areas that had the most rain and were most heavily impacted overall were Oxford and Southbury, which are both in New Haven County. Oxford had, in some areas, more than 16 inches.
Wow.
And Southbury had about a foot. And they were both devastated. The other areas that had significant rainfall were throughout Fairfield County, as you mentioned. They received some of the FEMA. They will be receiving some of the FEMA funds. Newtown received more than a foot. And then there's a lot of towns that received around the 9 to 10 inch range. But generally speaking, that upper part of New Haven County was the hardest hit.
And Michaela, especially with what Abby just shared, got a sense that the rain came down so quickly and so hard. So it's very difficult for people to respond immediately. And you reported on a couple of deaths during the storm. Tell us what happened in those cases.
Yeah, there were scores of rescues that emergency officials were able to do and get folks to safety, thankfully. But unfortunately, 2 women who had been reporting missing initially died when they were stranded in their cars and swept away by the flooded Little River, which is in Oxford. Their bodies were recovered Monday. And Audrey Rostkowski was 71, Ethelyn Joyner was 65. Both were from Oxford, and it's just really heartbreaking.
And you've been covering this since it was happening, and you had some chances to talk to people on the ground. You had a chance to talk to one particular person that I want to play a clip from one of your interviews here.
The tree got sucked into the river and it ripped the wires down with it. And that's when the lines came down and started arcing on the ground and created a fire.
So that was Mark Gannon that you spoke with. Can you talk about or tell us, where was Mark and what did Mark tell you about his experience?
Yeah, we were in Oxford where Mark and his spouse Emily live, and I met them on Monday morning when I went out to respond to the day aftermath of this historic flooding. And they live right near the Little River, which was one of the several waterways that had really bad flooding. And as you said, just affected so many homes and businesses. Emily recalled seeing the waters of this usually, slow-moving river eat away at a bridge on Sunday until it just gave out entirely. Wow. And when I saw it, it was just in 2 pieces. And then, as Mark described, that force of the floods brought down the power lines, and those were live. So he knew to shuffle away, thankfully. You keep both feet on the ground and to avoid electrocution, but the incident knocked out power and started a fire in their front yard. And it's just one of the many stories that came out of August 18th, and just folks devastated and in shock by what happened. And yeah, there was a lot to see that day.
Well, it's amazing that Mark knew what to do, and later on in this conversation, we'll get into more details about what you can do during emergency moments like that, especially when it's unexpected. And you spoke to many people. What else did you see when you were on the scene?
Yeah, it was, first of all, it was very tricky getting up. I came up from New Haven County, very tricky to get up to the affected areas with the dozens of closed roads due to the flooding. And so, first coming up through Seymour and then getting to Oxford certainly captured just a small portion of the things that were affected. People told me about their basements flooding, their cars just being completely toast after getting washed out, and people just being thankful to be alive. Chunks of roads and backyards caved in. You see the erosion that has eaten away at yards, and rocks, branches scattered across the road. I saw, trees completely sideways, and plants that were just horizontal on the ground. Just I've never seen anything like it in person, and not to mention just 24 hours later, the shock that locals were feeling, seeing their homes and local businesses and community upended.
Well, and I think what you describe is what many people, what they have felt, what they are feeling. And as we're getting updates, still in shock, still in surprise. And Abby, here's kind of a bigger question for you here in terms of why things got so bad. Do you know why it was so bad? Was the state not prepared for a storm to hit with this level of intensity? What were you hearing?
Yeah, that's definitely the case. I've heard from a couple different sources. I know that the meteorologist that we work with here at Connecticut Public, Garrett RGS, he was saying that the radars were not showing that there was supposed to be this much rain this quickly. The state's deputy commissioner of the emergency management department, I guess, she said that she called it unprecedented, and said it's the kind of storm that you see every 100 years. So we knew bad weather was coming, but I just don't think the state, especially some of these small towns that were most heavily hit, realized how quickly and how much.
Right. And now we're going to take a quick call from Mary from Hartford. Mary, you're on the air.
Morning.
Good morning.
So I'm Mary, and I live in Hartford, and I want to say that flooding may have been unprecedented in this particular storm, but these heavy storms are increasing all over the country. So, for instance, Hurricane Harvey dumped 57 inches of rain a year. That's more than the annual rainfall of Hartford, of Connecticut. And this unprecedentedness is the new normal. It is because of the climate crisis. And the state of Connecticut needs to develop new policies and prioritize watersheds and water flow rather than commuters and transportation as our new planning model.
Thank you so much, Mary, for calling us and sharing your comments with us. We certainly will get into more in depth in terms of policy later on in the conversation, and also with infrastructure. But also based on what Mary just said, Abby, can you tell us a little bit about responses from state officials? Was this unprecedented? Was it precedented?
Yeah, it was definitely unprecedented, and the state responded fairly quickly. On Monday, I believe it was, Governor Lamont declared a state of emergency, which is kind of the first step in getting some of that aid in here.
Right.
The Red Cross set up a shelter in Southbury. I visited there, and I spoke with some residents of Southbury in that area that had gone there seeking some help. And I don't know if that's still up and running, but they said, we're going to stay here as long as they need us to. We now have the FEMA money we can expect, which I'm sure Michaela can expand on. But the governor asked the president to say, "Hey, can you help us out here? This is really devastating." And yesterday, President Biden did, declare that he would use FEMA funds to help here. So there have been responses. There is aid coming in. There's also aid like on a local level. Team Inc., which is an organization in New Haven area, they have like a fund going where they'll provide, housing, temporary housing, basic needs, food to people who have been displaced by the storm. So there's some stuff happening.
Right. And Michaela, you also got a chance to talk with Bill Turner, who's the state emergency managing director. Can you tell us anything else about the state's recovery efforts?
Yeah, absolutely. So I checked in with Bill yesterday afternoon, and talking about the last couple of days, and he oversees the different emergency responses, and I'll say that the damage assessment is an ongoing process. This will be a long thing to recover from, and Connecticut agencies have been working really hard since Sunday to address the immediate safety and environmental concerns. And as Abby mentioned, the state is getting more help, as Governor Lamont requested, from President Biden and FEMA. And essentially, this federal emergency declaration allows federal agencies to lend their expertise to the state in the cleanup and recovery. For example, the EPA can help clear flood debris in propane tanks or oil tanks in waterways, helping out deep. Or the Army Corps could lend engineering help to help repair our dams, roads, or bridges. And just as a side note, this request does differ from a major disaster declaration, which can provide federal funding to support homeowners, businesses, and the local governments, which the state is actively working to get that data together to show damages qualify for that next level of federal aid. Turner said that as of yesterday, 800 homes and businesses had reported damage, and that was day 3 of recovery. So,
I'm sure it'll get worse.
Yeah, it's an ongoing thing. It's not a one and done.
Right.
The week is over. Everything's tied up. So, everyone's working hard to get that aid that folks need for their livelihoods. And Bill Turner said, if folks have damage, just take lots of photos before and after you do repairs. Just be really detailed with your accounts, and if you haven't already, report the damage to local emergency management offices so it can be included in that report.
Well, and actually building on what Michaela just said, Abby, I want to ask, especially with your housing beat knowledge, what Michaela just shared with the sort of both, I think, short-term and long-term recovery efforts from state, local, and the federal level. Do you have additional advice for listeners who are homeowners who may be struggling with flooding from the storm? Who should they reach out to for help dealing with the aftermath, on top of, detailing what you're seeing, taking pictures, for example, to sort of include in your sort of folder of information?
Unfortunately, there's not a ton to help homeowners when it comes to flooding. A lot of homeowners don't even realize that they are not covered in their insurance policy for flooding. So I think that's step 1, is to check your policy and see if you have any type of flood insurance, because that can make a really big difference. As I mentioned before, there are a couple local agencies that are doing kind of immediate help, Red Cross, Team Inc. But in terms of long-term, I would say check your policy, and also check if there are any local municipality-wide programs. I know that while Hartford wasn't the biggest hit area, we did have a significant amount of rain in the area still. And I know that Hartford has a history of bad flooding, especially in the North End. And they do have a program that was funded, I believe last year, I reported on it, with about $5-ish million specifically to help residents that have flooding in their homes and don't have coverage to fix up the flooding damage. So there aren't a ton of resources, but hopefully with the FEMA designation and maybe another FEMA declaration, we'll be able to get more help.
Anything you want to add, Michaela?
Yeah, that the Connecticut Insurance Department did hold a video conference call on yesterday, Wednesday at 1 p.m. To answer questions about storm damage insurance claims. But if you couldn't attend or have more questions, they're saying, feel free to reach out. They have an email, insurance@ct.gov, or you can contact them directly at 860-297-3900 and can answer, questions about these claims, which is, insurance is complicated. So
it is.
don't be afraid to
Absolutely.
call.
Do you mind just repeating the email and the
Sure.
phone number for our listeners who may be listening?
Absolutely. It's insurance@ct.gov, and the phone number is 860-297-3900.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us. You've been listening to Michaela Savitt, who's our state government reporter here at Connecticut Public. Thank you so much, Michaela, for being on today.
Thanks, Kat.
You are also listening to Abby Brown, who is our housing reporter here at Connecticut Public. Thank you, Abby, for joining us today as well.
Thank you.
And coming up, we talk about Connecticut's road infrastructure and what could be done to prevent flooding in the future. Let us know if you have a question or comment about what you're seeing this week where you live. We want to hear from you. Let us know how you're being impacted. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Connecticut's infrastructure is aging. This week, 27 state roads were closed due to flooding and others suffered major damage. That's according to the Department of Transportation. This hurricane season is set to be more active and severe than the past. And with that could come more flooding. So what does that mean for our infrastructure and our roads? Joining us now to talk about it is Michael Dietz. He's an extension educator at UConn and the director of the Connecticut Institute of Water Resources. Thank you so much, Mike, for being with us today.
My pleasure, Kat.
And also with us to talk about navigating the roads is Alex Lackey, who's the director of public affairs at AAA. Thank you so much, Alex, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And a reminder for our listeners, let us know if you have any questions or comments about what's happening around where you live. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Alec, I want to start with you. Earlier we heard from our reporters who reported that at least 2 people were confirmed dead from the flooding. And more than 27 state roads were closed earlier due to flooding or damage after the storms. Can you respond to what we saw and what you're also seeing around our state?
I mean, it's the devastation is incredible. It's, as the reporters described it, and as we've all been seeing over the past few days and hearing, it's just so dangerous out there, so devastating. And, our biggest advice at this point, after the storm, is just heed the precautions of the road signs, right? If there are barriers, make sure you don't drive around those barriers. I mean, occasionally we see that with something like a train tracks where people are trying to beat the stop arms and they go around them. And so don't try to go around those barriers. And of course, use your own judgment too. If there's standing water, don't drive into it, even if there is no barrier.
And Mike, as we reported earlier, we received so much rain and anywhere between 9 and 16 inches and more than that in some places here in the state. Why do we see such disastrous effects on our roads?
Well, I guess, first of all, I'll just start at the beginning here.
Sure.
Flooding is a natural part of the hydrologic cycle. This has been going on for thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, and probably longer. If in an example, if you can just think about the Connecticut River Valley, why we have such fertile soils there, it's because the Connecticut River had flooded and provided this fertile soil for us to use for crops. But Mary was 100% correct when she said that there have been significant changes due to global warming and impacting our hydrologic cycle. So I guess I'll step back and just say, as we developed on this landscape and we built, we had to build roads and bridges over the many waterways that we have in our state, The way that engineers design those structures, they use data from the 1930s and 40s to allow those structures to accommodate things like what we call a 100-year storm. I think Abby may have mentioned this. So they would size that structure to be able to pass the water flow from a 100-year storm. So the probability of that occurring once every 100 years or fairly infrequently. What we found, so basically everything that was designed prior to about 8 or 10 years ago used those numbers. So from the 1930s and 40s. When NOAA revisited all the data up until current times, up to about 2010, 2015, they found dramatic changes in the intensity of precipitation that we were getting in certain parts of the country, and especially here in southern New England. So what used to be a 100-year storm is now happening twice as frequently in the state. And the things that I've read about the rainfall that occurred, so the 16 inches in Oxford, that's basically off the charts. So we don't have enough data to say, we have about 125 years of good precipitation data that we can look at and calculate these probabilities. When we see a storm like this that dumps 16 inches of rain in 24 hours, if you look at the NOAA charts, they extrapolate out and say this is about a 1,000-year event, the probability of that happening once in 1,000 years. So you're going to hear terms like this, unprecedented, happening more often. And we see this in the news with these extremely intense storms happening more frequently now.
Right. And clearly, with the changes to the hydrologic cycle, there are reasons behind it. And can you talk about or expound more about how much is that related to climate change? Because so I have covered a lot of weather related stories out on the West Coast, but with the opposite problem of it being perpetually in a drought. But their
Sure.
drought and flooding, they're both extreme ends on that spectrum. Can you talk about how much of this is related to climate change and just expound more about, the reasons behind why we're seeing these very drastic differences?
Sure. So basically, it has to do with energy. So when we see global temperatures creeping up, this is just looking backwards now. I'm not talking about predicting anything into the future. That's another conversation. But we know that temperatures have increased when there's more heat in the atmosphere. There's more energy available to evaporate water from our oceans, from our landscape. The warmer air can hold more water. So, we've seen this with the hurricanes that happen. They're becoming more intense. Mary mentioned that, the enormous precipitation totals that happen from Hurricane Harvey. It's really all just due to that extra heat in the atmosphere. So that's really the big driver behind these changes in the hydrologic cycle.
And how do you expect these events to impact our existing infrastructure, as we've seen, and from both Abby and Michaela describing earlier, our reporters here at Connecticut Public talking about the erosion that they saw and people losing homes due to flooding. How do you expect these weather changes to impact the infrastructure that we have today?
Well, I expect that we're going to continue to see, more problems like this happening. As I mentioned before, the culverts and many of the stormwater infrastructure systems, even in our rural areas, they're finding them to be undersized. For example, the Housatonic Valley Association did a recent study looking at many stream crossings in their watershed and finding that a lot of them aren't even capable of passing a 25-year storm. So in the rural areas, you're going to see this infrastructure continue to be found to be undersized and not be able to handle these increased events. And when you get into our more urbanized areas, that infrastructure is even more difficult to upgrade. Think about being in downtown Hartford and you go down the city streets. There's a mishmash of utilities underneath those streets. The stormwater pipes in those big cities like Hartford and Bridgeport and New Haven, we have combined sewer systems. So we have sewage in the same pipes as stormwater. They're actively trying to separate that. And in Hartford, they're drilling the large tunnel to help store that mix temporarily. But those systems are easily overwhelmed with big storms like this. And you can look at the data from this week and see that there were sewage overflows from the Connecticut River, from Hartford, New Haven, Bridgeport, basically all the big cities, they had sewage overflows. So that affects the quality of the water as well, in addition to the damage from just the physical aspects of the water.
Well, with you just describing the physical infrastructure being prone to flood risk because of the older systems, are there certain parts of the state that are more prone to being flood risk as well?
I would say that the more urbanized areas probably are. I think it's easier to upgrade structures in the rural areas, just because you don't have it. It's just a less arduous task. For example, there's a bridge in my town here that was replaced last year. They put up one street sign and it gets fixed, and there's, barely any traffic and there's nothing else in the way. When you go into our big cities, it is just an enormous task to be able to separate these systems and upgrade that infrastructure. And takes billions of dollars to do this. And so I know that there is some federal aid coming in from the Infrastructure Acts that I think cities are using to address some of these problems. But I really do think that the more heavily urbanized areas are the most challenging ones to fix this problem for.
And is it correct to think that when it comes to cost, the urban areas, the price tag will probably be a lot higher than, say, a rural area?
That would be my guess. Yep. I mean, the struggle for the smaller towns is they just have a smaller budget overall. So it's not saying it's easy for the small towns to deal with it. The big cities have more money, but the problem is much bigger there too. So, it's really a big problem across the board.
And Alec, we want to talk about too with the fact that this was not the first major storm we've seen this year, and certainly it was very severe. And this is also not the first time we're having this conversation, but we're also expecting a very active hurricane season. So can you talk about, how is extreme weather impacting the roads and drivers and our infrastructure?
Extreme weather is obviously becoming even more prominent in Connecticut and the Northeast, because when we think about hurricanes and that severe rain and wind, we're thinking of Florida, we're thinking of the Southeast, we're thinking of the Gulf Coast and the Caribbean, but we're not as much thinking about it up here. We think about Sandy and Irene, and we remember those storms, but it's not something that's prepped for us in our day-to-day life, right? If you live in Florida, you're learning how to drive in the rain. You're learning what to do in case there's a flood. That's just, how you learn to drive. We don't really learn that as much up here. I mean, we teach it in our driver education classes, but it's not something that's drilled into the psyche of the Connecticut driver. And I think that the most important thing for people, and it's really the same advice we give to people everyday driving, is to slow down. I mean, certainly if there's any sort of severe weather that we know is predicted, we tell people to avoid driving. But as we heard earlier, the severity of this storm was greater than what was anticipated. So it's hard to say, anyone should have definitely not been driving. And certainly we saw what happened with people's homes as well, and folks who were staying home. But we tell people to slow down and leave space. If you can't, see for a good length of the car between you and the car in front of you, or even the cars to your side, we want you to slow down and give yourself an escape route, right? If someone brakes hard in front of you, or they go into a skid, or the driver in the right lane skids into the middle lane and that's where you are, you always want to have some way to get out, whether it's on your left side, right side, you're able to accelerate past someone. So that's good advice at all times. We're seeing bad behavior on the roads all the time, but if you're going to be in any sort of severe weather condition and you have to drive, keep it slow.
So we definitely want to get into more details about what can we do as drivers to pay more attention to both, your own safety and other people's safety. But I also want to ask Alec, what are you hearing from members of AAA in terms of the weather? What are you seeing?
I think people they're just unprepared, really. I mean, we talk about climate change and we talk about these 100-year storms, 1,000-year storms. And then you see, oh, there's a 100-year storm this week, and then there's another 100-year storm 2 weeks from now, and I think folks are just not prepared, and a lot of times they haven't necessarily prepared their cars. What we hear that people are, whether they're deferring maintenance because it's too expensive, or even just not taking care of the everyday tasks of, or I guess every month tasks of checking your tire tread and tire pressure, making sure your headlights are clear. We're hearing, when we've done our surveys, people are not doing that at the rate that they should be. And unfortunately, that can cause problems down the road.
Well, and Mike also touched on this a little bit earlier, but also would love to get your perspective on, what needs to be done to update our roads and infrastructure so they do become more resilient.
I think the grant program that he mentioned as part of the infrastructure bill, the Protect program, they have to have a good acronym for everything. I know that's hopefully going to give at least the start of ameliorating this problem. I know there's some formula funding that goes to the state, and then I know there's competitive grants, and I think the Naugatuck Valley Council of Governments won a competitive grant to kind of do some planning for resiliency for the non-coastal regions of Connecticut. But we're going to need to make sure that that is not a program that dies at the end of the infrastructure bill. This is activity that's going to need to take place all the time going forward. And whether we're looking at drainage ditches or culverts or whatever needs to be done to make roads safe and resilient for these floods, I think we're going to have to take a look at it. The problem is, this is infrastructure that's been around for many cases for 100 of years, not hundreds of years, 100 years.
Right.
And there's only so much that you can do. You can't rebuild every single road in the near term. It's not feasible. So you got to make the targeted investments and hope that aligns with what ends up happening.
So with the financial investments that we're talking about, it's both short-term and long-term. What about materials? Is that something that we need to start thinking about? Or I'm also assuming that we probably should start thinking about that earlier. But is that also an area that requires big changes?
There are permeable pavements that could help deal with this issue. But again, sometimes, we heard the amount of rain that came down in Oxford.
Right.
There's very, very few roads. There's very little that you can do to make sure that 16 inches of rain, that's going to put tremendous stress on pretty much any sort of road. So there's lots that can be done, but there's also a limit to how effective all those investments can be.
And Mike, I just want to bring you in real quickly to respond to Alec as well. I know we talked earlier a little bit about what can we do with aging infrastructure and also roads, but anything that we can do in the short term or long term that can help with the resiliency, both for drivers and for infrastructure?
Sure. Yeah, I mentioned the Housatonic Valley Association study that was done, and I think more work like that to identify the most vulnerable places. So that's part of what they're doing, trying to figure out, okay, which ones are the most problematic, the most undersized right now, or put life and property at risk if it fails. Doing, that's certainly something that can be done in the short term to figure out where to, direct money as soon as possible to at least avoid problems that we can fix right away. The bigger picture, like Alex said, you can't replace every road, every bridge, across the board all at once. There's just no way to do that. But you certainly can attempt to figure out which ones are the most vulnerable and put some resources there in the short term. Alec also mentioned the permeable pavements. That's a great tool, and that's something that we've worked on. I'm part of the Center for Land Use Education and Research at UConn, and we work with municipalities around the state to help them basically develop better and have less risk on water resources. As he said, nothing's going to really stop a 16-inch storm from causing problems, but for the vast majority of the rain that we get, there are better ways to do development that can lessen the risks, water quality and water quantity wise downstream.
You've been listening to Mike Dietz. He's an extension educator at UConn and director of the Connecticut Institute of Water Resources, and also Alex Latke, who's the director of public affairs at AAA. And they'll both be staying with us. Let us know how has flooding impacted your community this week, or if you have any questions, give us a call. Join the conversation, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WPR, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. This weekend's storm devastated communities throughout Connecticut. With us to discuss infrastructure, flooding, and staying safe in wet weather is Michael Dietz. He's an extension educator at UConn and director of the Connecticut Institute of Water Resources. And also with us is Alex Latke, who's the director of public affairs at AAA. And just a quick reminder for our listeners, let us know if you have any questions or if you want to comment on how has the flooding impacted your community. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Alec, earlier you kind of gave us a little bit of a driver's ed refresher. Kind of want to go a little bit deeper in terms of what do you want drivers to know about when severe weather events like what happened earlier this week is happening?
Well, like I said, I mean, number one, don't drive if you can avoid it and the weather is going to be bad in a particular area. And if you are going to drive, like I said, slow down. There's kind of this universal speed law that's across the country. So the speed limit is on 55 miles an hour on a given road, let's say, but that's in optimal conditions. Pretty much every state has essentially a reasonable and prudent law. And Connecticut's law says you can't drive at a rate of speed greater than is reasonable with regard to having regard to the width and traffic and use of the highway, the intersection of the streets, and the weather conditions. So if the weather is torrential rain, that speed limit's not 55 anymore. It's kind of in the discretion of a police officer. If you're going 54 miles an hour, that's not an acceptable speed. Are police going to pull you over in the torrential rain? Probably not, because they're probably dealing with emergency situations, but it's certainly still the law. We want to make sure you're as visible as possible. So, certainly keep your headlights on, but also keep them clean. That's something that people can do at home, whether it's with, some toothpaste or vinegar, or whether it's with baking soda, or you go to a mechanic and a headlight restoration is something that's fairly common for mechanics to do, or body shops. And we want you to be visible, and we want you to have as much visibility as possible. And so that means keeping your windshield wipers in good condition. And all of those are things that you should be doing kind of beforehand to get prepped for the road, as well as making sure your tire pressure is in a good place. The tire pressure can be found on your door jamb. Making sure your tire tread is in a good place. The trick that we teach is to take a quarter, you stick it upside down into the tire, and you see if you can see Washington's head. If you can see the tip of Washington's head, that means the tire tread is worn too thin, and you should start to look for new tires. So all those are things really that people should be doing before they hit the road in ideal weather conditions, and especially in rainy and torrential weather conditions. Those are things that are going to come in very handy.
Well, thanks for reminding me that I should actually check out my windshield wipers. It's not been doing great for me, so I'm going to have to check on that right after the show. Can you talk about also what is hydroplaning and how should drivers react to this if they ever encounter it on the road?
Sure. So hydroplaning is essentially when the tire loses traction with the roadway. It loses control, and you lose control of the vehicle because you're essentially floating on what could be a lot of water, or it could be a pretty thin film of water. So typically hydroplaning is happening at speeds above 40 miles an hour. That's in probably typical rain conditions, maybe not the flooded conditions, but with even as little of as a twelfth of an inch of water on the road, tires are displacing a gallon of water per second to make sure that the rubber is still meeting the road. So if you are hydroplaning, slow down as much as you can. It's the same thing with a skid. You want to keep looking at where you want to go and keep your hands on the wheel directed at where you want to go. We don't want people to, oversteer into it if they're emerging from a skid, because then you're going to have little to no control of where the car's going. So if you are hydroplaning, slow down, ease up on the accelerator, and hope that you can regain traction.
And I also want to ask about emergency kits. I think we hear a lot about kits for if you're stuck in the snow. So be sure to have blankets or extra clothing. But I'm not sure if we've ever really talked about having an emergency kit ready for something like a severe storm. What should we include in that kit?
I think if there's a severe storm where it's kind of a flood situation and your car is being moved, then the only thing that you're going to be able to do is you're going to have to get out of that vehicle if the car's being submerged, obviously.
Right.
But what you do want to have around is just snacks, food, medicine, water, in case you're stranded somewhere. And a charged cell phone and a phone charger. I mean, that honestly, the phone, yeah, everyone has it. But if you have a portable charger, because if the car for whatever reason is no longer working, you might rely on that car charger to boost you up. And if you don't have it, you're in an emergency situation, you're down to 15%. You need to be able to contact 911, contact family, friends, AAA if our services are required. So it's funny to say because it doesn't sound like a serious answer. So yeah, bring some food and snacks and have a grand old time. But those can be real lifesavers if you can't get to your home or another place of business in a timely fashion.
Well, and earlier too, you mentioned because Connecticut is not like Florida, where you're used to hurricane season in this kind of capacity. So drivers usually are sort of trained to be able to maneuver, certain situations. Whereas here in Connecticut, we don't really have that. So especially with storms and whatnots, when you do have these unexpected debris on the road, say, what do you want our listeners to know about how to navigate that?
So I think that the most important thing is leaving as much space as possible between you and the vehicles around you. And pretty much every piece of advice I'm saying is applicable in good conditions as well, but because you might want to look for potholes. But in this case, if a car moves out of control, a power line comes down, and debris starts falling from a car or from a tree or wherever, we normally say stay 3 to 4 seconds behind the car in front of you. That's an ideal conditions. You probably want to be staying 5 to 6 seconds in rainy conditions. And the reason we say seconds instead of, one car length for every 10 miles an hour that you're driving. And I heard that growing up. I bet a lot of folks have heard that. It's not that that's bad advice. It's just that we're really bad judges of distance when we're traveling at 30, 40, 50, 60 miles an hour. You're not really going to be able to tell exactly what one car length is. So we say, hey, look at something on the side of the road and see the car in front of you pass it, and then count, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. And then by the time you get to that object, ideally you've hit 4 or 5 or 6 Mississippi. And that way you're able to have somewhere to maneuver. But look, this is, it's Connecticut. The roads are crowded. And so if you leave that much space between you and the car in front of you, guess what's going to happen? Someone's going to fill that space. But you know what? That's fine. Then slow down a little bit again and create that barrier and that buffer, and if it happens again, it happens again. That's what we try to drill into people for driver's ed is drive your own trip. And when I started at AAA, it was amazing how it's like, you know what, I don't have to, I can go a reasonable speed and I still get to my destination, and it might take a minute longer, maybe 2 minutes over the course of a half hour, 45 minutes. But you know what? I'm a lot safer because I'm driving at a reasonable speed. And so that's what we try to drill into the heads of our driver ed students and
Right.
and hopefully listeners out there.
Right. So the theme is to slow down. And Mike, I want to come back to you for a sec because Alex just shared some tips for navigating our state during extreme weather, and it sounds like staying off the roads will help keep us safe, which is the number one thing. Are there further health risks when it comes to these rain events, especially that's hot summer day?
Well, I think the primary health risk from the events that we were just talking about really is in the combined sewer overflow areas. So if you're planning to go to the beach, I would imagine that many of the beaches along the Western Sound were closed all this week because of the bacteria that's in the water from those overflows. So I would definitely avoid swimming after big storms like this, and even going to shellfish areas. Typically, those will get closed down by the town as well. So I would say that's probably the biggest health risk from a water quality perspective.
Any other public health risks that you can think of right now?
I mean, aside from the acute physical damages that occurred, I think we probably covered everything, I would say.
And Alec, I know we covered a lot of driver's ed information and just things that we can do to stay safe for both ourselves and for our fellow drivers. But are there anything else that you would like to share with the listeners, or what they hope to come out of this conversation today, especially just coming off of a very severe weather event?
I think, we heard it earlier about the flood insurance for people's homes, and we see that for cars as well, making sure that you have comprehensive coverage that'll cover you in case there is flood damage. Certainly, if there is flood damage to the car, it might not be safe to drive. Make sure the car dries out before you start it, because that might salvage the electronics in the car. It's just like a phone. If you drop your phone in water, you're probably not going to start it right away. You probably want to let it dry out. Car has tons of electronics in it, so you want to do the same thing. But of course, life and limb is way more important than your car. But make sure that you're as protected as you can be. So if these events do come up, we don't want you surprised when the insurer is not covering what you think it would cover.
Well, thank you so much for sharing those tips with us today. You've been listening to Alex Lackey, who's the Director of Public Affairs at AAA. Thank you so much, Alec, for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
You're also listening to Mike Dietz, who's an extension educator at UConn and also director of the Connecticut Institute of Water Resources. Mike, thank you so much for sharing your resources with us as well.
Pleasure, Cap.
And just a reminder for our listeners to be sure to stay safe out there. I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible and Chloe Wynn. Our technical producer is Eugene Armatruda. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you so much for listening.